Let's have a discussion on this work. Follow the discussion for free and just pick up the ideas. But if you're interested, I do have a sheet music edition of this work, and there's a link for that in the description. But also, this is a special collaboration with lutenist Elizabeth Pallett via her excellent website, luteweb.com. So what you're going to see is you're going to have my performance and lesson on this work, but you can also see it performed and a lesson on the work on Renaissance lute. And so you'll kind of get a little bit of both. So there's links to her videos in the description, and as well as on the website post that I've made, where I'll put everything side by side. And you can also see our Zoom discussion where we talk about the work. And so you can really learn a lot from getting the guitar version, the lute version, and a discussion on this piece. So there's 2 manuscripts for this work, and I've based mine on the Siena Lute Book, the version that's in that lute book, which is in Italian tablature. Italian tablature is similar to modern tablature, except that it is upside down from our perspective, with the highest note or the highest string on the lowest line and the lowest string on the highest line. So it's quite confusing to read if you're not used to that. But the interesting thing is when you make a notation edition of the piece, is that suddenly there's a lot of decisions to be made. So when I made my notation edition, I have to decide like how long the note values are, if I'm going to split it into 2 voices or 3 voices, what notes are part of what voice. And so there's lots of options that occur, lots of issues as well. So I'm very excited to have the discussion with Elizabeth Pallett on doing this, because I have so many questions for her in that regard. So you can kind of see, like when you look at either Italian tablature with the numbers representing the frets, you can see it's like in some ways your conception of the piece might be that it's just kind of like scale passages and chords on the fretboard, and you just kind of play it. But in the same goes for the French tablature. If you're reading it in French tablature, the same thing exists, is that when you look at the tablature, it might look like just a series of like little melodic lines and chords. However, when you listen to it in terms of music history and music theory, and when you put it into music notation, suddenly it becomes not quite that. It becomes individual voices that are moving horizontally across the page or in music, right? So voice independence within the lines. And a lot of this piece I've written out in 3 voices. I think the majority of it is in two consistent voices traveling, but there's often 3 voices as well, and implied inner voices. So when you look at the music notation, you get a much more rich kind of a rich appreciation for how many voices are happening. Whereas when you look at the tablature, you might be fooled to think otherwise. However, if you're experienced, reading this lute tablature, I think you get very used to seeing it differently and also just really hearing it and in your performances to decide, the individual voices that occur. Also very important in this work is bringing out the motivic imitation. A little bit tricky in this piece. There's some real obvious motifs that reoccur throughout the work, but it's in this particular style, the fragments are somewhat short sometimes, and they come and go. So it's super imitative, but it's not super strict. It's not like a Bachian, Baroque fugue. It's not quite like that. It's a little bit more free in that regard. Let's just take a quick look at a comparison of the Italian tablature, French tablature, and music notation. So if we take a little passage, why don't we just take the little passage at measure 21 after the cadence there. So first, when we look at the notation, it's really quite easy to see the that upper line, and then you can see it in the inner line. Changes a little bit at the end there, but that gives you some idea of some of like the imitation in the piece and how it switches voices, and you can see in this case you can clearly see that upper voice and then the sustain there while the inner voice takes over. So you have this kind of interlocking and overlapping musical lines. When you look at the Italian tablature, you can kind of see the same thing. It's all there, and it's even visually kind of there pitch orientation wise, because you can see the individual entrances in different registers, right? Whether it occurs on the top lines or the middle lines or the bottom lines, gives you some indication of pitch, at least. Not always if we're messing around in upper positions, but in this piece, in first position, it gives you some idea. You just can't see the note values, so it's a little bit harder to conceptually make sure that you're sustaining note values properly. However, again, if you have some music history experience and you have some music theory knowledge and you're just used to this type of music, then looking at the tablature and playing it, you will be able to hear it and bring out those lines, bring out the imitation, sustain voices. So it's kind of like you don't need one or the other, but you do need the experience, and you need to be thinking in this frame of mind. I think, and that's the issue for many guitar players, is that if they just go to play the tablature, for example, you don't always get the conceptual aspect of the piece. Same thing when we look at the French tablature. We're using letters instead of numbers for the frets, but you still get that upper line. So that B, C, B, those are the fret indications, not the pitches. So it doesn't matter which system you're using, you still have to put it all together, both in your mind and your performance, and then make it as clear to your audience as possible. So in my edition, I've made a notation edition and a French tablature edition, because French tablature is a little bit more commonly easy to read. And then I've also made an Italian comparison score, so people can kind of compare the original tablature to what I did, because there's lots of different choices you can make. You don't have to write it out always in three voices. You don't always have to choose. Maybe I very well could see someone making different choices as to what notes are part of what voice, just on some occasions. A lot of the time in this piece, it's a lot of two-voice writing, so it'd be fairly clear. But when that third voice gets involved, it gets a little bit more complicated. So I fingered this music for relative lute tuning. So I'm tuning the third string down to F sharp or down a semitone. And then I'm placing a capo on the third fret, kind of an imitation of the lute and lute tuning. When you do this, you can actually read the Italian tablature or French tablature just as it was written. But I am using the notation version at the moment, but I'm quite comfortable with French tablature reading it. Like I can read through pieces in French tablature. Italian tablature, I do get mixed up a little bit. I can do it, but it's pretty choppy. But that's the tuning I'm using. So it's kind of an imitation of the lute in that regard. And it also allows, in this particular piece especially, it would be quite difficult to play without that tuning. All those F sharps would be closed and it would be interfering with the fourth string ringing out. In fact, this is one of the works where you really wouldn't be able to do it with a different tuning. It really has to be in that relative lute tuning. So I think I'll just walk through the piece first, and we can have more discussion afterwards, and you can watch Elizabeth Pallett's video and our discussion to get much more info. As I go through it, I'll also just point out a couple of places where the two manuscripts differ, because I'm basing this off primarily one manuscript, but there is another one with this work in it, and there's a couple of small changes. So when you see it performed, you sometimes will see some small changes made to it. Really great, like just single line little opening. I like to frame it with those E's that are as arrival points. And then at measure 10, you have it split into multiple voices. So just a little bit of attention of your horizontal playing here. And you'll see that I use some freaky fingering sometimes, but that's to facilitate the legato voicings. Same inner line there. So actually at measure 34, there's an open F sharp on the bass there in the other manuscript. And here in the Siena Lute Book, it's an open A, but in the other one, I believe it's an open E, or like the open sixth string. This is all relative to lute tuning, of course, when I say note pitches out. I'm just going with that one source. Here's that theme again. Here it is again. Couple of other changes in measure 57. There's actually an additional high E in the first beat in that other manuscript, and in measure 63 in the other manuscript, I believe it's a C sharp or like second fret. But I just kept it as normal. And then the last two measures drastically differ between the two manuscripts. In the other version we have, well, in this version we have that, and the other one, sorry, this is G sharp. Quite a different ending to the two works. That little motif really occurs throughout the whole piece. That's like for me one of the stronger little imitations that occur throughout the whole work. But there's lots of similar lines in this piece that they're very, very similar, but they're not exact. So it's tough for me to say like what the main theme would be. There's definitely lots of imitation though. Some of the opening lines, they're very similar in their shaping, but the intervals aren't exactly the same. But some of the ones I pointed out, as I played through it there, are much more clear. And then some of the little runs and things like that as well. When you're conceptualizing this piece, I think, for me, it really comes down to like being more of a vocal work and more of a one of those, imitative Recercatas. There's, it could be a little bit more rhythmically interesting. I find on the classical guitar that because we have so much sustain, it's not quite as plucky as the lute. The rhythmic aspect can sometimes like mess with the phrasing of the individual lines. So I have a difficult time performing these pieces sometimes because I want to go further in the direction of like a vocal work. And if I try to imitate like a lute performance of it, I find it kind of doesn't always work on the classical guitar. So that's why I'll be so interested to hear Elizabeth Pallett's performance. And then we'll have a discussion on it so that we can just talk about all these things, and it'll be a great discovery of performance practice and of this lovely piece.